Afternoon. Sorry for the late start. We'll just wait for some people to come in. Thank you everyone for your patience. Cool. Some more people may come in. We won't wait for much longer. Hello, Roy. Hello, Stuart. This is a sort of Hello, Roy sort of webinar. A lot of people are away for Easter. A lot of people watch this on replay. We are recording this. But this was just an opportunity to chat to Roy about everything and anything. Obviously, his experiences are particularly in banking and financial sector policy, and in fiscal policy and everything related to national treasury. But Stuart, do you maybe want to introduce Roy before we dive into some questions? And he's now our CEO, of course.
Sure. We're very excited to have Roy joining Intellidex a few weeks in now. And Roy has a really strong background in several of the areas that Intellidex has historically worked in. So financial sector policy, I guess, stands out as the main one. Roy spent 15 years with National Treasury, and while in that role, pioneered and developed a lot of the key financial sector regulation as it stands today, including the Twin Peaks model we can talk about later, and was generally a key member of the senior leadership in Treasury. And I always used to chuckle at the photos that our former Minister of Finance was prone to tweet days or moments before budget speeches, in which Roy always had a corner part of. And subsequent to Treasury, spent 2 odd years at the Western Cape Treasury. So really has both a national and local government perspective on broader finances of government, which is a very valuable experience that Roy is bringing to our business. So pleased to see him there in the office, the team hard at work over his shoulders, keeping an eye, and to be able to share some thoughts in conversation with Roy. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Stuart. And yeah, I think useful, Roy, you're sharing. We do have an option. You have people. You know, there has often been a view that it was just Stuart and I writing columns. Yeah, we are much more than that. We need a CEO. We have a lot of people now. But just to dive in, Roy, I mean, you know, to start off your experience in National Treasury, you know, where do you think we are at, if you like, in the sort of broad policy-making, long-term, multi-decade cycle on fiscal policy? This is, you know, it's a long-term consolidation that's been going on. We are only part the way through it. I mean, where do you see us when we take a massive step back on this broad trajectory?
That is a very interesting question. I mean, I think, and as you know, I think the Treasury is trying its very best to deliver this long-term fiscal consolidation. A lot of internal debate, and I think external debate about whether or not a fast consolidation is better than a slow burn consolidation. Perhaps more recent years has been a tighter fiscal consolidation, but I think really you need to think at the long-term growth trajectory of the country. And we are not in a great long-term, point, mainly because of electricity constraints. And I think that's really feeding into the whole fiscal story, right? You can't distinguish between the fiscal story and the electricity story in any meaningful way.
Okay, but do we play that forward? Does it mean we're too tight or we're too loose in fiscal policy?
I think we're kind of appropriate at the moment. I mean, I don't think the Treasury has much choice at the moment other than to try and slowly keep expenditure tightly under control. I think if the Treasury were to increase expenditure quite significantly, it runs the risk of losing all credibility and letting debt spiral out of control, whereas an even tighter fiscal position has these very interesting impacts on growth and on service delivery. So previous job in the front line in terms of health and education and infrastructure delivery. And you can see exactly how what happens is that the Treasury reduces expenditure, and the first places that get harmed is usually infrastructure, because it's the easiest thing to cut. You can always delay infrastructure spending. So you kind of run the risk of actually cutting off the long-term driver of economic growth, which is infrastructure expenditure, if you don't design your consolidation correctly. I mean, I'm not sure if the Treasury is actually actively consolidating at the moment, and more like just holding the line. So on that very note, the building is changing from generator power to electricity. So here we are talking about electricity constraints there we go, as you know, and I mean, I can't overemphasize how this electricity constraint, right, impacts on business. And I think on the ground in South Africa, this is kind of a normal sort of company. Just imagine what that's like for like a manufacturing company. So sorry, I'm going off onto electricity because we're in the middle of load shedding. But a very, very important story in terms of what we need to get right.
This compositional efficacy of spending point, I think we've always talked about, the damages of top trimming, as we call it, and not making big strategic choices. But does that debate really happen, or is it a case of Treasury is fully aware that there are issues with this style? They just obviously have no choice from cabinet. So how active is that sort of view of the potential damage from this style of consolidation into service delivery? Actually, do you think?
Yeah, I think you famously call it salami slicing. So what happens is that you slowly but surely slice off pieces of the budget, and that creates harm and I think the Treasury is very aware of this and keeps on raising this issue. If you read the budget documentation, in terms of the impact, for example, on education service delivery and health service delivery and infrastructure service delivery, is that you also then have this problem that you aren't able to keep growth, you aren't able to keep up with service delivery. So you might end up pausing hiring of teachers, for example, in fast-growing provinces, or you may end up not building infrastructure capacity and so you kind of create your own growth constraint, long-term growth constraint. And this is I think the Treasury is very keenly aware of this problem. And secondly, pushing very hard to make sure that the big spending items where you can get success or kind of quick wins, which is obviously wages, the SOE bailouts, etc., to really, really push those hard. Because if you just look at the impact of the wage freeze, just that 1 year of wage freezes and how that structurally changed the entire trajectory of the fiscus, it's quite extraordinary, right? And then you can see now how the Treasuries continue to push wage pressure down, but then you've also got these kinds of never-ending pits of the state of enterprises which are just sucking out cash. And if you read all the documentation, you see how the Treasury is doing all this stuff. What they're doing to balance the fiscus is that they are, by almost, the only way they can get this right is to take away money from growth-enhancing areas of spending. Because you've kind of got this point where you're sort of sucking in all the money from particularly wages and state-owned enterprises. So I think one of the things the Treasury needs to really think really hard about is how do you turn the fiscal position into being more of a growth-enhancing fiscal position from a compositional perspective, not from a total amount perspective.
Yes, that was sort of the point I was going to come on to. You want an almost tight macro, loose micro, right? In your style. And I think when we think about basic income grant, when we think about wages, right? We run into problems doing the macro and the micro, right? I mean, on the wages, for instance, I think we all cheer, notionally a tight stance on that on the surface, but then you realize what happens in terms of attrition, in terms of not hiring the right people. We all have examples of particular teams that need a person that can't hire, etc. So where do we find that balance? Or is it simply not possible if the cabinet doesn't take the big decisions?
Yeah, I mean, cabinet does need to make, I think there you put your finger on it, is the political will take the big decisions to actually deliver on the micro spending. It's a very nice way of contextualizing that you kind of have to get, you really have to start thinking at a very granular level about what you're spending on.
Indeed. So where would you prioritize, or how would you rewrite if you had to do a zero-based budget, which was promised, right? I think it was promised. Even the IMF said in their bailout, not that we call it a bailout, that there would be zero-based budgeting. How would you go about that process? What would be the lessons?
Right. So I think you would. You first have to take a really long, hard look at. There's some very interesting demographic shifts. Certainly within the contours of the country, if you look, for example, the Eastern Cape, you see empty schools. If you look at Gauteng, you see very, very full schools. So first thing to think about is the composition of spending spatially as one of the components. So that would be one component of zero-based budgeting. Similarly in healthcare, similarly in infrastructure. So first start building up the budget from those sorts of key areas. If you think about the functional areas of the budget, so that would be learning and culture, is I think how they classify it, health and welfare. Then I'm not against sort of a social welfare floor. I don't think this is necessarily a bad idea where we are right now. And then you're left with what's classified as kind of economic services. One part of that is good, which is infrastructure spending. The other part of that is not so good, which is support for state-owned enterprises. But there you also have to be quite careful because you have to dig into each of the different state-owned enterprises, identify what role they play in the sort of developmental state, not developmental state, what you think we're but in the delivery of long-term growth. So, you know, is it necessary, for example, to have an arms manufacturer? Is it necessary to have airline, et cetera, et cetera? You could zero-based budget quite easily if you actually started just top slicing out these big, difficult spending items. And the Treasury is doing a lot of this work. So there's a lot of spending reviews going on in terms of trying to work out exactly what spending is happening and how it's spending and how to be done better. Efficiencies, for example. But that's kind of how I would go about it.
The spending review is really interesting because they're not really publicized. I mean, there are various GTAC working papers that appear deep in websites, but Treasury kind of holds the line, but you never quite know why on the outside. I mean, obviously the work goes on the inside, but they don't seem to campaign, if you like, for an alternative vision till now, right? And now the president's asked them to think about different sides of the states, etc. Some of these things are maybe coming out a little more clearly. But I think the point you raised on the basic income conference is or a social grant is very interesting. You know, why do you want zero-based budgeting? It's actually to do these things like the country needs, you know, a social floor. Actually, it's not just, you know, for the hell of being tight in fiscal terms necessarily. Just switching track onto sustainability. How do you think Treasury, because every budget or MTBPS, it seems we switch to what, you know, the underlying anchor is. Is it debt GDP? Is it primary balance, etc.? What for you is or should be, or your personal way of looking at this, and why do you think Treasury flip-flops like that a bit?
Okay, so my personal approach to it would be kind of, you have to think about it in a really old-fashioned way of thinking through monetary policy, almost the sort of pre-inflation targeting period, where they had what they called an ultimate objective and an intermediate operational objective. So I would cast the way the Treasury thinks about fiscal policy as being the ultimate objective is debt stabilization and debt reduction. The reason the Treasury, and they've said this publicly a number of times, doesn't want to pursue that as the operational objective is because a lot of the parts of that are outside of the control of the Treasury for a variety of reasons. And so you have to choose an operational objective that the Treasury can achieve that gets you to the path of debt stabilization. And the Treasury takes a very theoretical approach to this. It's quite difficult to communicate. But the theoretical approach to this is that the first thing it needs to do to try and achieve the long-term objective of debt stabilization is to run a primary surplus. And that you can technically work out what the size of the primary surplus is that you need to run to deliver on debt stabilization. And the reason why we can run a small primary surplus, well, the reason why we have a little bit of space as a country is because we have inflation. And so if you think about the kind of R and G framework, where to achieve debt stabilization, you need to look at the long-term borrowing cost versus the long-term growth cost, just as a pure algebra. Because you've got some inflation in G, you've got a little bit of space in R. And so the long answer to this is basically choose an operational objective called the primary surplus. And that's essentially what the Treasury is trying, I think, to communicate when they're always flagging they're trying to hit a primary surplus, is that that's actually kind of internally the operational objective of fiscal policy. That makes any sense.
No, I think you were much clearer than Treasury is often. I mean, I think it's all clouded in this sort of layer of uncertainty. But you make an interesting point. R, I think, is lower than people think. It's not 11.5% long end of the curve, right? It's 6.8-ish, whatever. G is higher, given the deflator often is above CPI. And actually, this thing is not as impossible as it seems on the surface, albeit reaching that primary surplus or large enough primary surplus maybe is. Do you think cabinet and the political economy care about pure macro fiscal? Because the debate we always have with investors is why you don't run electoral fiscal cycles, why you don't go crazy on whatever it is, including basic income grant, including comprehensive social security reform, NHI, all the rest of it. There is this underlying fiscal conservatism which we assume will continue even next year, right? But we never quite know why. How deep, from your experience, do you think that really goes?
I get a sense that there is deep fiscal conservatism. I mean, faced with some quite easy choices, generally politically the choice has been the difficult one, which is kind of remarkable if you think about it. You know, it's very easy to add money to the fiscus. It's, you know, particularly in an electoral cycle, the attempts to do sort of populist policy have not really worked out that well. And the really interesting one is actually the size of the social relief and distress grant, which is 350 Rand a month. And that, I think, gives an indication of the fact that politically the view is that 350 Rand is an appropriate, affordable amount. And it's a very small amount. And I haven't really heard much talk about increasing the, obviously a lot of papers, and famously the IAJ has this whole analysis where we should be doing it at the low bound of the poverty level or high bound of the poverty level, whatever, and it should go up to, there's even one group that for some reason think that paying the basic income grant at the minimum wage is appropriate, which I completely don't understand. But that's not the view, politically the view. That's not politically the view. So there is a deep political conservatism, I would say.
Indeed, and South Africa is unusual in that sense versus other emerging markets, and is why bond investors often worry that this will suddenly end, albeit we know the track record. Just thinking about some of the sort of underlying issues, there was a massive fight, I think, 18 months ago or so. It was through the sort of initial, maybe wave 3 or so of COVID, about multipliers, and it's sort of a thing one tags one's fiscal start or fiscal flag to. Where are you on the multipliers question?
Okay, so the first time I did any multiplier work was when I joined the Treasury 20 years ago. I haven't yet really changed my mind. It's really hard to do this econometrically for a whole variety of reasons. But I'm generally of the view that government consumption is not a positive multiplier. So wages, increasing government wages, generally the inflationary impacts outweigh the growth impacts. Government infrastructure investment is generally slightly positive outcome So that goes to your compositional point again, is that in the long run, obviously adding, tax, generally where we are in the cycle at the moment, there's a lot of research on this from both the Treasury and the bank and independent researchers. Generally, tax increases at this point in the cycle on growth, just growth harming, suggesting that tax cuts are probably growth enhancing. So if you have to choose a kind of out of a bag of fiscal measures, a combination of increasing infrastructure spending and reducing taxes is probably going to be the best. Even if your macro balances deteriorate, that's kind of your best outcome.
No, indeed. I mean, I think that's what the debate, 18 months ago or so missed, was this sort of pick and mix style. This is not this, simple, single graph on multipliers, and you make a tax choice on your social security spending, right? And it's the mixture of the two that is your overall multiplier, not your simple, pushing a certain sort of expenditure out into public. So yeah, the debate is a lot more nuanced. Do you think Treasury has like a pick and mix view of these things? I mean, do they have a dashboard where you feed stuff in and view its compositional multiplier effect?
No, it's a model.
Because they never publish this sort of thing, which is annoying, which I think in the UK, of course, you get from the Office of Budget Statistics, you get quite a clear view on things like breakdown of impacts by income decile and growth impacts and inflation impacts and that kind of thing. The Treasury doesn't make it quite as clear.
Yeah, I think the model has been published in the past. I know there's a version of the model somewhere that has been published. Technically, so there are three broad camps of models inside the Treasury. There's an overall structural macro model, which kind of doesn't disaggregate that much. Then there has been CGE modeling in the past. The bank has also built up a lot of capacity in CGE modeling. And then there's a whole DSGE modeling model, which a lot of it has been published. Lots of parts of it have been published, and a lot of the fiscal tests. There's a paper from Stellenbosch from Hilton Hollander on different debt. And that's kind of what the Treasury, the Treasury's view is what we call the debt financed infrastructure expansion.
Yeah.
Those sorts of thinkings. And then I think the Treasury has published its fiscal multipliers thinking.
Indeed, but not as like an update with each MTBPS and each budget. And that's come up in committee and from NGOs, right, around the need for some kind of economic impact assessment, which I think might help the debate. But yes, it's an interesting question. People, please do ask questions in the chat or raise your hand on fiscal first, and then we'll do banking and financial things with Stuart. But some fiscal questions from Jill, and yes. I don't know how you describe the first one. Ideological question, maybe. Do you subscribe to the fiscal theory of inflation, Roy?
Yes, broadly.
Why?
I certainly think at a high level, there's substantial expansion of the fiscal is inflationary. I think obviously through the there's a very deep thing which Jill and I have discussed a long time, and Stuart has actually done his PhD on, which is in the nature of money and to what extent government debt and money are interchangeable, particularly short-dated government debt and money become very murky where the one starts and the other ends. And in that theory, I guess, if I can remember my fiscal theory of the price, which will correct me, the effect of large amounts of debt have similar effects to large amounts of money printing. And I certainly, intuitively, a substantial expansion of the fiscus would be inflation.
Because
the only way of doing it is through wages, which is very inflationary.
because the argument that's dominated more from the SARB, right, is more of a risk premium argument, right, in terms of interest rates. I mean, the inflation argument's there, but it's often more dominated by a sort of risk premium view in terms of rate setting as opposed to second round effects.
I mean, I know I'm not against the bank's view. I mean, I think the bank's view is that the long-term yield is set by the Treasury. So long-term interest rates are set by the Treasury, insofar as they reflect fiscal choices, the size of the deficit, the borrowing, the structure of borrowing, how we have a very long dated portfolio which might increase long yields by the nature of the fact that you've issued a lot out at the end, and so there's not much demand for the paper at the end, and so you have to pay more for it. Very straightforward thinking. And that the short end is set by the bank. And that's a nice intuitive way of thinking about how the yield curve works, I think, and it's kind of how I think about how the yield curve works. And notice how the government thinks how the yield curve works.
I wanted to come on to the yield curve. So as people know, I do a sort of quarterly, either in person or online, set of interactions with our clients, and the number one question this time, actually from everyone, which was people have thought about this in the past maybe, but was why is the yield curve so steep, and why is the long end so high? And these very basic questions that I think we need to revisit all the time in South Africa. Now, there's a huge amount and volume of research, I'm sure will remind us, has been done on this question, but it still feels we don't really know, right? There is a whole pick and mix of reasons why we had the issuance yesterday of the R2053, the ultra long bond as well. And maybe just some thoughts from you on your choice of those reasons for the steepness and for how high the long end of the curve is in your view, Roy.
It's a very simple view, simplistic view, which is I think is largely to do with issuance. So there's a lot issued at the end. So I think that pushes up the price. The yield curve has always been very, very steep, which is curious. The argument might be that you should issue more along the curve to flatten the curve. But that might also be there's a lot of demand at the short end. There's obviously the straightforward sovereign risk premium, but like you said, it doesn't explain the whole story, because sovereigns with similar risk profiles to us don't have such steep yield curves. Even after I don't think it's inflation. I don't think that there's some excess inflation expectation that the market has. I don't think that there's any concern about the bank's credibility to deliver on inflation, even under very, very difficult scenarios. So it's not inflation. It's not necessarily the fiscal position. One thing that I have been playing around with some people to think about is this risk of long-run social instability as kind of a tail risk.
Yes.
So yeah, I haven't myself yet quite worked out. There seems to be a missing piece.
Exactly. And that's why I say we don't really know, right? If we really push this. I mean, I think the social stability thing is there in some amorphous way of, traders sitting in Southampton worry about this. But I think it's quite hard to put in any delta around it. The reaction of the yield curve to the July 21 unrest actually was relatively muted, actually, versus December last year in Pala Pala as an example. But no, I think that's something we will get you to write some papers on, no doubt, Roy. And just a reminder to people, clients will be seeing a lot more of Roy in various capacities and thought leadership and various notes on all fronts. And Jill just in the chat making the point that she would like an even longer bond than R2053. We'll see how that goes first. Just segueing to Stuart now in a minute. I just wanted a general question on PFMA. It feels like this thing was a religion, and as an ex-Treasury person, maybe you have some insight into this, a religion that now suddenly feels slightly fragile. There was a lot of resistance to things like PPP reform for a long time. Now that's happening finally. The whole question in the last couple of days over ESCOM and reporting and that kind of thing. It feels like post-state capture we are wedded to this thing that is sort of inappropriate and needs some reform. And you in particular, we're obviously in a provincial treasury function as well, having to deal with these issues and things like procuring and financing. So some thoughts on the sort of structure of PFMA might be interesting.
Yeah, so the big problem with PFA, which is I think what the Treasury was trying to communicate in the last few days, but maybe didn't communicate it so well, is that the PFMA isn't great for very large companies. It's much better suited for government departments. It's kind of the financial management piece of legislation that is everything tries to be everything to everyone. And so you've got Eskom has complained about this for years, obviously, so has Transnet, even some of the bigger, well-run, fiscal, the Financial Conduct Authority, complained that PFMA doesn't really work for them. It may be better just to push them straight into IFRS and require them to issue company statements. I mean, the big reform in the Companies Act was to create a category of state-owned enterprise in the Companies Act, which means that you can bring in all the international financial reporting standard requirements and impose them on the enterprises. I guess that's what the Treasury's maybe been trying to communicate, that maybe the PFMA imposes requirements that are overly onerous on Eskom. I don't think they made a particularly good case of that. And I think they have now withdrawn their statement, which is, I think, the correct course of action. But that doesn't quite get away from the fact that I think there does need to be some PFMA reform. It may be to catch up parts of it I mean, the PFMA is now 1996, 1998. I think there is a lot to be said for just trying to make it catch up to a lot of the other regulations, to a lot of the other stuff that's happened, for example, in Companies Act regulations.
No, indeed, and it hasn't really come up in the PSEC work or in the SOE reform bill work or that kind of stuff, which has been more about shareholder compacts. But an interesting point, I think there's been a lot more debate on this after the hoo-ha and a little bit of foot shooting maybe this week, even though, as you say, the underlying reasons are there why this isn't exactly optimal.
Yeah.
But let me hand over to Stuart to start to delve into some banking and financial sector issues. Over to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Peter. So, Roy, a large part of your career was building regulations around the banking sector, and I guess your academic interest, at least at PhD, was bank failures. So I want to start with that because it's always an exciting topic, and globally we're in the midst of bank failures, and indeed had one of our own banks put into curatorship a week or so ago, and the creation of the Deposit Insurance Corporation last week. So there seems much happening. Let's start with a global question. What should we be learning from the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and maybe Credit Suisse's problems?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, I think that maybe I'm talking a regulator's book, but I mean, there's a point where regulators aren't running banks. If a bank elects to have duration risk and interest rate risk unhedged, is it really the regulator's fault or is it the bank's fault? You know, it's a very interesting collapse because it seems, in retrospect, it was like, oh, this is so obvious. They didn't hedge their interest rate risk. And I think it's a really interesting case of just a very straightforward error that they made. And a very good salutary lesson, I think, to the whole system, that you can make these very basic errors.
Was it an error of regulation or an error of board leadership? I mean, given that the US regulatory structure exempted banks of SVB size from proper interest rate risk stress testing, I mean, that was a regulatory choice. Now, of course, it was also a board management choice to run a book that had huge duration risk in the midst of an upward interest rate cycle. So it sounds like the causal emanated from both the regulator and the management.
Yes, I mean, obviously, as you point out, they had been exempted from Dodd-Frank as a result of a lot of political pressure, particularly under the Trump administration, which means that they didn't have the same level of stress testing imposed upon them. I mean, it's always a question about, is it management or the regulator at fault? They had themselves argued to be exempted from the regulations. So I guess from a regulatory perspective, you're like, well, then you're kind of on your own. I mean, the reason why you have regulations is because you are putting a lot of taxpayer money at risk. And this is a completely straightforward example of that. But I'm not sure then, is it Congress that made the error by exempting them, or is it, I mean, what was we know what happened. Trying to pin blame is quite difficult.
So let's talk about
what the risk manager was thinking.
Let's talk about the resolution process. I mean, this was the US bank insurance body that went in to take over control of the bank. Much like the corporation of bank insurance that we now have and will soon become the main resolution vehicle for banks here. But the US and the SVB story, to me, is not a great example of a deposit insurance scheme effectively resolving a bank without recourse to the fiscus, because in fact, this appeared to have become a systemic problem.
Yes.
That's really swamped the capabilities of the resolution framework
Yes.
that existed. Are we going to make the same mistake?
Now, first of all, the deposit insurance scheme is not for resolution. It is, and it's really poorly targeted. Not only is it not for resolution, it is there to protect depositors in the event of a bank failure up until a certain limit. I think if you start trying to stretch its role into being part of a resolution framework, I think you might be asking too much of the scheme. You know, I think in this particular case, I mean, there was a lot of political pressure, obviously, to expand, you know, implicit deposit insurance in the US for a variety of reasons. That will happen in any situation, certainly will happen in this country. Is that a failure of the FDIC? I'm not sure. But I think the lesson from this is that you don't use deposit insurance for resolution. Don't confuse, don't get the two, I think separate the two out is how I would think about it.
Interesting. So we had the curatorship of Habib Overseas Bank, was it a week or two ago?
Yes.
A tiny bank, right? Only 400 million of liabilities. But that case was the Banks Act. And it wasn't quite clear whether this was an example of insolvency that required the curatorship, or what really was the trigger for curatorship. In the new resolution regime, would the same triggers be available in an example like Habib? What do you read the triggers to have been?
Yes, I mean, the triggers are cut and paste. In actual fact, the new triggers are slightly better worded. A lot of court cases over a number of years about the triggers, because the first thing you get taken to court on is the trigger. So there was an emergency application when BBS was put into curatorship to have the curatorship set aside. You know, that was declared, you know, the court considered, you know, I think the New Republic took the regulators to court on the night or something on the morning. I think it was New Republic. You probably remember than me, Stuart. So the trigger is very well established in law, and the wording of the trigger is very well established in law, and that wording has been taken across to the new regime. So I don't think there's a huge change on the trigger. What really happens is that you have a lot more tools available to you once the trigger has been pulled. I think is sort of the long and short. Obviously, as I highlighted in my notes, the IMF and a lot of people have highlighted the fact that the trigger is still a discretionary trigger, which basically says, in the opinion of the governor, he advises the minister, and the minister exercises his mind. And every time you put a bank into gradership, I've only put 2 banks. I've only advised on 2 banks in into gradership. Every time you write the memo, you make sure that there is ample proof from the minister that there is no doubt that this is required. And look, you prepare those papers on the basis that the court will ask the question: has the minister applied his mind to this question? It's an administrative action.
I'm interested, Roy. One of those 2 that you worked on was the African Bank curatorship, and that has now, I think, resolved. And I think I would certainly describe it as a success. And it was an interesting use of the good bank, bad bank model that we had seen globally in the financial crisis. And if I compare African Bank to Sambo that preceded the financial crisis, given that there wasn't much change in regulatory machinery between these 2 things, but the way these were dealt with, I mean, Sambo put into liquidation with a huge bill to the taxpayer to bail out depositors, and African Bank with no bill to the taxpayer at the end of the day. And this bad bank, good bank resolution structure that has allowed for a bank to emerge that is now functioning healthily. But the regulatory tools were exactly the same. So my question is, to what extent do the regulatory tools actually matter when it comes to developing the state of the art in bank rescue?
So not technically same tools. I mean, the law was changed during the middle of the curatorship of the African Bank to allow one additional tool, which was transfer of assets, to allow for the legal framework for bail-in. But conceptually, your question is completely right. Big lesson from Sambo is act sooner, act faster, act harder. I think, and be afraid. That's a lesson. The African Bank curatorship was done as soon as required, probably slightly, it was done as soon as required. It was a full-on, everything was prepared. Sambo, there was a lot of toing and froing, a lot of questions were asked. By the time they made the decisions, it was too late, I think.
There was already a run.
Like an abiding lesson, just do it.
Got it.
And as you say, the impact, oddly, I mean, an African Bank, I feel sorry for Chris from PwC, not Chris from PwC, but is that the guy that's just finished the work out at African Bank is now an appointed curator of the next one.
A fruitful career.
Yeah.
Roy, with deposit insurance coming in, what do you anticipate the impact on competitiveness in the sector to be? Given the history of small bank crises we've had in the country, small banks just seem to be a very tough place to do business. And does deposit insurance lessen the perception of risk there?
It's intended to. So I mean, I think like you say, let's take a good bank for example. As you say, it's small. They've got governance problems, etc. And they need a lot of oversight and supervision, etc. But that kind of billion-rand bank, it's surprising we don't have more of them. We've got a whole layer of cooperative financial institutions and cooperative banks that, in other jurisdictions generally grow up into slightly bigger banks. In actual fact, the US is a really good case study of this. These kind of Silicon Valley Bank being a very, very pressing front and center thinking one, which is hyper-regionalized banks that serve a particular market niche. If you think about where you might see banks developing, it's you know, I think it's in, you know, underserved areas, you know, cooperative kind of financial institutions in underserved areas that are kind of pooling savings and investing and creating wealth. To get that to work, you need very strong regulation, and we have that in the Cooperative Bank's Department of the Reserve Bank. And one of the big things we did secretly, not secretly, but quite of the big reforms during Twin Peaks was actually to move cooperative bank supervision from the Treasury to the Reserve Bank, and to wrap it into the Twin Peaks framework. And then in addition to that, in deposit insurance, so that people know that they can take risks. I mean, I think then, you know, things like why do taxi drivers not create credit union? Why do teachers not create a credit union? Why do public servants not have a credit union? These are things that happen in all other jurisdictions, but not here.
If I could take a stab at one possible answer, is that the regulations just limit the size of those balance sheets to a point where the economics don't work. You can't cover the operating and running costs of a cooperative bank, given the thresholds you have to stay within.
Well, someone, I won't mention their names, has done a really good study about proportionality in banking.
Very good, right?
I think the Intellidex study in proportionality in banking is kind of correct in these things, is you're missing a whole layer of banking.
Yeah, so I wanted to draw you into this question because, you know, our analysis is that we're busy misusing the Mutual Banks Act to create a tier 2 banking structure. And it's not, you know, Mutual Banks Act is meant to embody the principle of mutual ownership, not the principle of a second tier of banking system.
Yes.
And, you know, are we, so, and from what I understand, there's a pipeline of applications under the Mutual Banks Act. So it does seem to be the one area where competitive pressure is arising, but it's not purpose built. I mean, is there grounds, do you think, for this to really be taken seriously as a regulatory development priority?
Yes, I mean, dedicated banks has been on the agenda for a very long time, which is essentially the same idea, which is a category of banks that aren't mutuals. Yeah, but you need deposit insurance first or at the same time. You know, there's a slide from a presentation I made to Parliament 100 years ago about this little thing called, you know, not to use the past is not necessarily always a good thing to draw up in these conversations, but, you know, there was this cooperative thing called Volkshuis in the 20s. And if you follow the history of this little thing, you know, as it transitions from one thing to another thing to another thing, you know, by the mid-80s, it's okay, it also had its own problems in the 80s, but by the time we get to the 80s, you've got a really big show. You know, if you follow the history of this little bank called Standard Bank, which was created in, I think, Victoria West, it transitioned regulatorily from one thing to another thing. But I think we're still missing that intermediate thing.
It seems to be a Sahara desert to cross between small and big. That's very hard to cross. Just one question I want to pick up from Jill, who I'm sure remembers Volkshuis days.
Yes.
But Jill asked a very contemporary question. So with Credit Suisse, we saw FLAC instruments really being used to the shock of many of those FLAC instrument holders, particularly that they could be wiped out before shareholders. Now that seems to be rather a Swiss peculiarity. I noticed the Bank of England was very quick to point out. But this is the first time I think globally we've really seen FLAC instruments being wiped out in a what do you think it's going to do for the market in those instruments?
Well, I mean, I really don't think it's great for the market. I mean, Joel will tell you, I mean, she's asked the question, but I mean, they're incredibly illiquid instruments. It's conceptually a great idea that you've got this convertible instrument, but it's very difficult for the market to price because you need to, when you're buying the instrument, you have to do a probability of the instrument being converted, and then you need an actuary to, it's, and then your other option is equity, which everybody should be able to price, and senior debt. Everybody understands that. So trying to get the stuff issued is very hard. So the market is generally very liquid. And now the first time a really big bank uses it, it kind of comes across as being a zero write-down. The interesting technical thing about African Bank is that the tier 2 instruments were never written off. They were actually converted into stubs. So they actually function, now we get into technicalities, as contingent convertible debt, proper COCOs. And in actual fact, what the curator, this long tail curator, has been doing over the past decade since the collapse of African Bank is paying off the stub, which is actually essentially a kind of an equity-like instrument that these debt which conceptually makes a lot of sense, is that what we do is we take away the instrument, which we give you in return, we give you another instrument, which is an equity instrument. You still have some holdings. It's a very long way of saying this is, I think Basel IV is back on the agenda. I think the Basel Committee is going to have a long, hard think about this. And there's maybe an opportunity now to rethink a lot of these resolution tools.
Interesting. We've got a few minutes left, Roy, and I just want to get off banks for a little bit. Another thing that happened in your tenure as Treasury was the introduction of competing capital markets, stock exchange.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your outlook and thinking on capital market infrastructure providers is for a small country like South Africa.
I think there's some natural monopolies. So clearing is generally in most jurisdictions a natural monopoly. Settlement is a natural monopoly, almost by definition. Although you can build, and we've had to build settlement systems that are interoperable. So you have to have partly because if you're clearing and settling bonds, you have to be able to clear them and settle them in either Euroclear or in JSC, depending on a whole bunch of reasons. But it's easier just to have one single settlement system. A whole variety of reasons it's easier to have one clearing system. This is kind of the Australian model. Where the instrument trades, I don't think you need one. I think, particularly in the emerging market, there's no reason why you can't have a number of different trading venues.
Do they need to be in country?
The trading venue?
Yeah.
I think for legal reasons, the matching needs to take place on the soil of the country. Well, no, that's not even necessary for matching. I mean, Anglos match offshore.
A secondary listings.
The
reason I ask is because I think it's to your point on developing countries, that there is, I think, a dated notion that having a domestic stock exchange is an important development stage. And I'm not sure that that's true anymore, given globalized technology and the fact that trading venues can be anywhere. And this creates an opportunity.
Local currency problem, right? I mean, I agree with you theoretically, but I think there might be an interesting local currency problem. But there's no reason why, not to sell Intellidex. We can do some work in Rwanda, developing capital markets in Rwanda. For them, I think they should try and develop a local currency market. There's an argument that maybe the LSE, the London Stock Exchange, can offer Rwandan denominated instruments.
Or in fact, the JSE could offer Rwandan denominated instruments, but currently can't because of exchange control.
Yeah, they could. They offer non-ZAR denominated debt. And they do offer non-ZAR denominated derivatives. So there's no reason why they couldn't apply for a non-ZAR denominated. I don't think. But yeah, I mean, the point, you're right. I mean, there's no reason why it would make a lot of sense actually for Rwanda to issue Rwandan denominated instruments somewhere else.
Good, thank you, Roy. Let me hand back to Peter to wrap us up.
Now, just to ask you some closing questions. I mean,
Yeah.
on the upside and on the downside, what are the things you think clients might be missing as a former policymaker in a provincial and a national sphere? What do we miss, both the positive and the negative?
Well, you know, Peter, you and I have debated this topic quite a lot. Are we missing the fact that I'm sitting during load shedding and there was a very brief turnover, which means that the electricity problem is being sorted out itself? Two ways that comes into GDP. The first instance is investment, and the second issue is that get rid of the electricity constraint for manufacturing. There's an upside risk there, I think. That growth might, you make this argument, I'm not sure I completely agree with you yet, but you know, we'll have to see. Yeah, so that's an upside argument. Risks to the fiscus, there are still tax risks to the fiscus. That is still a tax risk, I think.
And nothing that keeps you awake at night on the financial side?
On the financial side, no, not really.
You designed the framework so well that obviously not.
No, I mean, you know, to be fair to these bankers, they, you know, the only thing I'd say is maybe that, yeah, you know, the banks in this country, I mean, interest rate risk is something that dealt with, like exchange rate risk is something that, I mean, they know inside out. Interest rate risk is something they know inside out. They maybe are overly conservative in the sense that they've maybe done too many stress tests. And the staff has maybe done too many stress tests. And so everybody's just sitting on too much capital for what the country needs. But then you also wonder if that's appropriate given the fact that there are lots of risks out there. And then it's a very diversified banking system. You know, it's you know, Silicon Valley Bank is like a really good example of this very undiversified bank. But we know from the global financial crisis that countries like Canada, Australia, South Africa, with very diversified big banks, generally do okay. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're sleeping well at night. We're going to keep you busy though, as our CEO. Everyone will be seeing you through various routes in consulting projects, and our monthlies, and our you know, client thought leadership and capital markets products. So yeah, as Stuart said at the start, very excited to have Roy on board. He'll be joining, you know, various of our client roadshows, and you'll be hearing from him a lot. But no, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you everyone who is going to be listening into the recording of this. So we start a little bit late, and have a lovely Easter, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.